Okay, so I have a list of questions, but we only have about 15 or 20 minutes, so I'll open it up, and if you guys are shy, I'll ask a question or two. Does anyone have a question for any of the panelists? And yeah, there's a microphone right here, apparently.
Just in case you need to know, I've been informed.
Which hand is which?
The right is the Cubs.
I figured that if you were showing it.
Up 4-2, yes. I noticed in all of your presentations, there was a certain absence of two letters, DG. Comments. Distributed generation. That's for the audience.
I know I can comment on the level that most distributed generation from a MISO perspective generally sits behind the meter. If you're talking about that scale of anything that sits behind the meter is invisible to MISO. So it's distributed solar, distributed, carbon-friendly resources are probably going to be part of the solution, but I don't get to see that animal. I have to be able to anticipate and understand what my asset owners are trying to do, my load serving entities are trying to do on that regard when it comes to a transmission evaluation. Is it going to be part of the overall scheme? I can't imagine how it couldn't be. But from a maintaining system reliability, it's one of the many components that are going to get us there on that front. And unfortunately, I don't get to see it. I don't know if Flora is at a different view because she's much like, I believe, kind of how we are in that regard. Her customer base are the asset owners and load serving entities that would be responsible for that as well.
I agree. And again, we anticipate those will have a lot more impact on the distribution system as opposed to the transmission system. We are looking at it. We're thinking about, what might happen if there is a large penetration of DG, but it's not at the level yet where we have the certainty that we can really think about how to plan for that. We do rely on our customers, who are the utilities, to incorporate that into their load forecasts, which is how we would most likely see it and take it into account.
I would add a fun fact on that I learned last night that I wasn't aware of, is in the federal plan, you're limited as to what you can get credit for. Essentially, either under a mass base or a race base, you can't get DG credit for DG reductions. So, or actually energy efficiency reductions either. So if Wisconsin ends up with a federal plan, you're not going to be able to get ERCs or mass-based credit for that.
One quick comment on that is that a lot of other markets, DG isn't necessarily just behind the meter, but it may be behind the substation at the level, at the disco level, and in Europe and in other emerging markets, microgrids, they're leapfrogging this technology. And not accounting for those kind of innovations kind of puts us behind the eight ball.
I will turn the mic to my friendly state representative here because unfortunately, so from my perspective, and this is something that's very important from the regional transmission organization in this part of the country, is we are in a traditionally regulated part of the country when it comes to state regulation of the utilities. MISO has no insight and no authority when it comes to the resource adequacy question, and that's where that DG question tends to sit. So that's why it's really invisible to me on the most part. And I don't disagree with you. There's a lot of technology sitting out there that needs to be considered, but unfortunately, from my perspective, it really is invisible to me. It's going to be impactful, especially once it gets into larger penetration. But until that happens, I actually don't get to see it unless it's being force-fed into our hands, which right now it is not.
Did you have another question?
Sorry.
Sorry.
No, I remember. Do you think, in terms of taking a regional approach to compliance, that MISO will be the organization that sort of negotiation takes place, or the organization of MISO states, or some kind of regional entity based on MISO will be kind of where this planning takes place?
I'm not sure. I think MISO gets to play a facilitation role in some of that discussion, but remember what I said earlier, you know, out of our 15 states, only Wisconsin is actually fully a member of MISO. Every megawatt hour that's served here is MISO. Every one of our other states have multiple RTO membership. And because of that, is MISO the right answer? I think we play a part in that forum in helping coordinate our memberships, our member states. But there's also a group called the Mid-Continent State Energy and Environmental Regulator Group, MCR for short. And it is actually sponsored by a completely non-MISO related organization that basically has the same footprint definition, where it's bringing the energy and environmental regulators together to have these same types of discussions. So the forums exist out there. There's a lot of conversations that are going on. MISO can help in the facilitation of those roles, but are we going to be the central forum to get it done? My guess is no. It's going to be driven by those states and where they think that they can get to where they need to be.
Any other questions from the crowd?
Sure, I'll ask a question for Flora. Of the energy savings you mentioned for T&D, how much of that will be creditable since 2012, I assume?
Oh, we haven't done that analysis to say how much would be credible. And I haven't studied really the rules yet for, you know, how to measure it and how to verify it. So we'd have to do all of that. So, you know, we've looked at all of the major transmission lines we put in service since 2001. So there's probably not as many actually after 2012. There'll be more with the MVPs.
Any other questions? Well, I have a just general question that I think would be good for everyone to answer, which is, do you think Wisconsin can meet the Clean Power Plan and keep the lights on?
I like the answer over here earlier in the conversation. I can make anything reliable if I have an infinite amount of money.
Is that, you think that's true even though we've only got 6 years and with the permitting processes?
So my position on all of this has been, when it comes to compliance, reliability is an end goal. Your constraints on your system are your timing, what you have to work with. I can make it reliable if you don't mind spending the money to do so. If you want to mitigate costs, then having more time to do so, more time to find the right solutions. Because how are you going to stay reliable? You're going to ask that coal plant that probably should retire because it's uneconomic to continue to operate and find offsets, because you're going to be paying New York for credits or something to that extent. So you're going to increase your costs if you can't get there. So yes, I personally think we can do anything to really make the system reliable, as long as you don't mind the
Paying
cost
a lot.
component of it. If you're going to force an issue, this coal plant has to retire. There may be some regulatory constraints that keep you from getting something built in a timely manner, but I think at that point you are talking, because from my perspective, if a unit says he wants to retire,
You got to let him.
I have to force him to maintain operation until the infrastructure is built to allow him to retire. That's actually what our obligation is if someone puts in a retirement, they are allowed to retire once the infrastructure is available to allow it to retire reliably. That's the problem, is I think where we're talking about time frame, is 6 years, 7 years, 8 years enough to build that transmission system to facilitate? Maybe, maybe not, but if it's not, then I think the expectation is you got the reliability safety valve discussion says you're expected to make that unit run, and they're going to have to figure out how to buy those allowances from the system, which I don't think is going to be a cheap situation at that.
Do you want to add anything? Anybody else?
Go ahead.
I was just going to add that, I mean, the delay in the start and also the much smoother glide path will be a big help, because if you look at 2022 and to 2024, I think it is, you know, it's not such a huge reduction. And so there may be opportunities to do some things faster to meet that part, and then take a little bit more time with other larger, more strategic options and take those out to 2030. So I think that'll be a help, but I think that, you know, we just need to be very creative about how we approach this.
So my take on that is really the answer depends on what Wisconsin does in terms of submitting a state plan. If it acts quickly, and then if it doesn't block itself from trading with the other states that are part of the similar programs, I think the reliability issues can be largely mitigated. but cost could be higher. That's the connection between cost and reliability. So, I think final rule is a big improvement relative to the proposed rule for mitigating those threats.
So I was going to ask you, and since you talked about cost, you mentioned that peakers aren't included, CTs aren't included in the plan, and my understanding is that they can run up to something like 30% existing peakers without triggering any requirements. And so would you agree that, and for everyone that doesn't know, peakers are usually the most expensive units, and so do you think that's essentially a cap on how much the plan could cost, that the peakers would just all come on?
I don't know the local requirements in every area, of course, but in general, you can run your peaker as much as you want. It's just a matter of cost, additional cost you pay for the dispatch of it. It really depends on whether those credits, ERCs, the allowance prices are high enough to trigger the gas CTs becoming more economic as a compliance option. So it really we'll see. But I don't see any, other than local emission requirements, I don't see any economic limit of running them higher.
Anybody else want to?
I think that's one of the concerns that we have, is that as we implement, if we implement in Wisconsin, we want to make sure we're making the right choices, because we want to avoid situations where you do have those peaker units dispatching ahead of a much more efficient gas plant, where you're getting half of the energy out of the gas that you're burning. I mean, that doesn't seem like a smart resource trade-off. I think that's a concern. You know, if you run a model, you can certainly get a model that shows you run a bunch of peaker units ahead of other units that would be more efficient. It's just one of the many variables, and I think coming back to the DG side, it's another variable to model in the sensitivities. I know MISO would be looking at that. Commission's looking at that kind of what types of futures do we think would be there, what penetration of DG would be there on the system. There's a lot of variables to think about, and that's another one.
So I think we have time for one more question.
I think it's mainly for Flora. Flora, you mentioned the horizon for a MVP project. With you having multiple members and potentially multiple projects going on at once to update generation systems, what sort of timeline are you looking at for not an MVP project, but Alliant puts a new plant on, WEC puts a new plant on? Can you coincide pretty well with their timeline for construction, or is there a potential extended timeline and some challenges with that if you have coincidental projects going on at one time?
If somebody wants to build a new plant, they get into what's called the generator interconnection queue, and they need to get in there in a pretty timely, early enough that we can make sure that we have the transmission in service by the time that they're ready to operate. And those two timelines align pretty well right now. And it doesn't, because it's a known, if somebody goes into that and signs that interconnection agreement and goes through the whole queue, it's a kind of a known change, and it's much easier to plan for that and to also permit for it. So those timelines line up pretty well. It's when you have larger, more wholesale changes that it creates some challenges and opportunities for us.